All right, it's 4 o'clock, so we will go ahead and get started. Welcome to today's webinar, The Perfect Blend in the Time of COVID. My name is Mary Carnahan, and I am the Digital Learning Resource Specialist at the Indiana Department of Education and your host today. We will get to our main event in just a few minutes, but first I want to cover a few housekeeping items. When you joined the call today, you were muted. Please keep your line muted to minimize background noise and distractions. If you have any bandwidth issues, you may want to ensure that your camera is turned off. You are welcome to either have your camera on or off. That is up to you. Like Michelle just said, it's nice to see faces, but we also realize that there's other stuff going on in our places of work right now. So it's up to you, but they do sometimes cause some bandwidth issues. So just keep that in mind. Also, you should see the chat box to the right of your screen. Please use that to ask questions and to share ideas throughout the webinar today. Also, if you haven't done so, feel free to introduce yourself. Tell us where you're connecting from and maybe something that you're hoping to get from the webinar today. Also, when you use that chat box, be sure that you select everyone from the drop down, from that to drop down. Sometimes it defaults to the presenter. So right now it might default to me, or when we change presenters, it might default to Michelle, but just make sure it says everyone so that we can all see your comments. If you are looking for other professional development opportunities, I wanted to share a webinar that we have coming up on November 10th. This is the last in our 10-part series, Teaching in a Digital World. In this webinar, Shannon Dick, our STEM specialist, will be sharing information on STEM and PBL. The URL for the registration is on the slide, but I will share it in the chat in a few minutes along with the Teaching and Learning, or the Teaching in a Digital World series, webinar series page that has links to the slide decks and recordings of all of our other episodes, our other webinars in that series. And before I pass the presentation on to Michelle, I wanted to mention our book study. Many of you are probably already participating, but I wanted to invite others to join. We're in week 6 of the 10-week book study, but you're still welcome to join us. The steps to join are on that slide, but I will also include them in the chat in just a few minutes. And now I'm going to turn the presentation over to Michelle Eaton. She is the Director of Virtual and Blended Learning at MSD of Wayne Township, and she is the author of The Perfect Blend. So welcome, Michelle.
Unmute. There we go. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. Thanks for the introduction. I have really loved the book study. So if you haven't joined in the book study, I've been jumping in and chatting with everyone, and it's been really enjoyable. So thank you all for participating in that, and please feel free to join us at any time. I am excited to talk about some of what we know about high quality blended learning and what that means within the constraints of a pandemic and the experiences you are facing right now. Many of you have been in the chat already sharing kind of the context in which you've returned to school. If you haven't, I'd love for you to jump in the chat real quick and kind of let me know, what is your school running on right now? Are you teaching completely virtually? Are you fully back in person? Are you hybrid? This presentation, regardless of how you are teaching right now or how you might switch to teaching, is kind of a holistic look at blended learning in a way that helps us move fluidly between models in uncertain times. So I hope that you'll get something out of it regardless, but I'd love to see that. So please use the chat. Like Mary said, I'm the Director of Virtual and Blended Learning in Wayne Township. So if you're familiar with Ben Davis High School, that's our flagship high school. My role here is to oversee course development and professional learning for our online high school and all of the blended initiatives, K-12. So I've been doing this for several years, and this last March, my job definitely shifted some. And the book that I wrote, kind of the things we're going to talk about, really was geared toward K-12 classroom teachers, the things you can do to leverage online learning to improve classroom instruction. So that's how you can reach me. There is my Twitter handle and email if you ever want to connect further. So it looks like we have some folks that are completely virtual, a lot of hybrid, a lot of fully in person. That is great. And one thing I've noticed as I'm talking to schools and even thinking about the challenges we face in my own district, that even though we're all kind of going back in different models, we all face three really similar challenges for the school year. So first of all, we all have to be able to teach in person and online this year. And for some of us, that's happening concurrently. I don't know if in the chat, how many of you are also, if you're teaching in person, you're responsible for teaching students that are choosing to be remote or students that are quarantined at the same time that you're doing your full-time teaching in person? Yeah. Yeah, I figured that's quite a few of you. That's one of those things that I don't know that pre-COVID anybody would have said this is an ideal blended model. We're surviving in a lot of ways. So having to teach in person and online, regardless of whether all of your students are back in the classroom or all of them are remote and working from home, collaboration and building connections between students is a challenge because we're either physically distant or we're in a classroom and students aren't supposed to be moving and they need to try to stay 6 feet apart from other students. And we can't get together and do some of the hands-on learning that we are used to doing. So that becomes a challenge we have to face. And then finally, the reality is with numbers spiking across the state and across the country, we have to be prepared to move between those models fluidly. And we want to be able to transition from some form of face-to-face to fully remote in a way that is better than probably what we experienced in the spring when we were kind of slammed in the face with this pandemic and moved into this emergency remote teaching. We have to make sure that learning keeps going and that we don't create additional gaps that we might have created in the spring. So that said, blended learning is our best friend this year, regardless of context. It's the thing that I think is going to help us face those three challenges. So just to start to make sure that we're on the same page, when I'm talking about blended learning, I'm talking about it before, that's any combination of face-to-face instruction and online learning. So more than just using technology, but we're actually going to have some instructional opportunities, some assessment opportunities happening online. So what this might look like for you could be you're fully back face-to-face, but to address students needing to collaborate, to prepare students for a potential move remote, you're introducing elements of online learning while you're maybe meeting one-on-one or in small groups. It might mean a hybrid approach where the face-to-face instruction is happening a couple of days a week and the online instruction is happening at home. That's a combination of the two, so that is blended learning. And then it might mean that your school year is blended, where at some point you're fully remote before heading back into the building. That said, I think we have a pretty great opportunity. There's a lot to be stressed about this year, and there's so many ways this is not ideal. I wrote this book on blended learning because I believe in blended learning and I love it. And I never would have guessed that we'd have to be implementing it with so many constraints in place. But I think the opportunity that we have right now is that we don't have an option but to innovate. And we can take this year to really learn how we can leverage online learning in powerful ways. And once those constraints are removed, I think we can really transform our classrooms. I think you can provide an education that's just as good this year, even during a pandemic. that I think we can change what schools look like moving forward. And so I'm excited for us to really reflect on the things that haven't been working in schools and throwing those out. And I think blended learning is one solution to making some pretty transformative change. So a lot of the structure of this presentation is really focused on thinking about synchronous practices and asynchronous practices. Two words you're probably sick of hearing by now, but just to make sure that we are all on the same page. When I'm talking about synchronous instruction, talking about live instruction, we're all doing the same thing at the same time. Generally, we talk about synchronous instruction in online learning. So we're usually talking about getting into a Google Meet or a Zoom room and having class that way, whether it's whole group or small group. For the purposes of this conversation, I want us to think about just live instruction in general. I want us to really look holistically, live if you're in the classroom, live if you're remote, and thinking about making decisions about how we use that time regardless of environment. And we'll talk a little bit more about that holistic thinking, but when we're talking about synchronous or in sync or live. Asynchronous, on the other hand, is more of the on-demand learning. So the independent instructional opportunities, or maybe you have students engaging with video instruction and participating in some formative assessment and moving through the lesson sequence at their own pace. And that asynchronous instruction, the flexibility of that is going to vary. So if you are a first grade teacher and you're trying to do small groups, and so the independent work is an asynchronous online lesson, it's synchronous in that we're all kind of doing it between 9 and 10, but students are moving through each activity at their own pace. Or it could mean you're fully remote and your students have all week to complete this asynchronous lesson. And so the flexibility is really expanded. But that's what we're talking about. The digital lesson students move through more independently versus a live instruction. And when I had mentioned kind of thinking holistically, one of those challenges that we face this year is next week we could go remote, or 2 weeks from now you could be told that you're bringing students back into the classroom, and those shifts can cause a lot of disruption. And if one of our goals this year is to mitigate some of those disruptions, I really think planning our time live with students and the digital lessons that we have them work through independently, if we can think about that holistically, where I'm not trying to plan for what my live instruction looks like face-to-face versus what it looks like, what I'm doing in those 2 days in a hybrid model versus what I'm doing in a Google Meet when we go remote, if I can think about, I have limited time live with students, regardless of environment. What am I going to use that time for? And what am I going to move into a more flexible learning environment? And then if I've made that decision face-to-face, where I'm still really leveraging asynchronous online learning, even physically in the classroom, to help students connect and collaborate and to allow me to meet individual needs, when we move online, the disruption happens because we're moving to a new environment, but the learning isn't disrupted. It's business as usual. We're still going to do the same online lessons. We're going to now still meet live, but we're going to do it in a Google Meet. And so I think framing it like that might help us in managing this job that feels larger than life right now. So considering those two modes, like I said, I'm speaking to whatever context you're in. If you were to ask me what's the number one thing to keep in mind as you are designing online experiences, I would tell you that creating highly interactive learning opportunities, regardless of what you know about online design or how many web tools that you feel comfortable with, if you can create an opportunity for students to interact in 3 different ways in an online lesson, you're going to create a really great online lesson. This is the first place I would look. So we are going to look at synchronous instruction and asynchronous instruction through the lens of 3 types of interaction. We're going to look at student to teacher interaction, opportunities for you to interact with your students, whether that is remotely or face-to-face. ways for your students to interact with each other, regardless of being physically or socially distant, and then how do you get students to interact actively with digital content so that it's not this static or passive experience. So let's first start with synchronous instruction, so that live instruction. I think the student-to-teacher interaction seems pretty inherent in that, right? Students are asking questions, you're engaging directly with students, even if they're remote. I think the thing to keep in mind here is that as we think about our live time with students, that we are not putting the lecture on a pedestal. If you get into a Google Meet with all of your students, we can easily kind of shift into this thinking where I need to get all of the content to my kids, and that's what I have to do with my live time with them, or the 2 days a week I have with them. And we can do a lot of talking to students instead of making sure that it's a two-way interaction. So just keep that in mind as you are identifying what is it that needs to be live. I think that is going to look different for a kindergarten teacher than it does an algebra teacher, than it does a French teacher. And when I'm having these conversations with the staff in my district, it's really asking them to think about what are all of the functions you serve as a teacher within your context. Now, if you have to prioritize what are the most important things that you're going to be doing with kids this year, it's probably not lecture. We can replicate that really easily with technology. So if I prioritize my most important functions, now let's see how can we use technology to help me do the rest of it. And pre-COVID, this is what I love so much about blended learning, was this opportunity to essentially clone myself. There are way too many responsibilities on our shoulders, even without a pandemic, as a teacher, that if I can let technology do what it does really well, it frees me up to do the things that only the human being in the classroom with students can do. And that's where I think the real power of blended learning is. All right, I'm getting a little off track. Something else to think about in student-to-teacher interaction during synchronous instruction, if at any time you are meeting with students online, whether that means you're live streaming to kiddos that are home or you are in a Google Meet, I wouldn't require students to turn their camera on. That's a whole other debate that we can all have on Twitter if you're interested. But I would say as the adult, the instructor, to turn your camera on. And I would say, we'll talk about this a little bit in content too, but having your face visible in videos that you post, using video and audio feedback, like your presence as a way to humanize the online learning experience is so powerful in so many ways. And there's significant research to back that up. So I would encourage you to model that for your students. I also would encourage you to think about synchronous instruction as more than just whole group. I think whole group live instruction, especially when we're talking about remote learning, is the hardest thing to do. When I think about even professional learning that I lead, like this is intimidating. There are almost 70 of you in here. And if I were to think about how can I ensure that every single one of you is paying attention and actively engaged in this whole group learning situation, like that's hard. That's really, really hard. And that's with adults. And I think it's a whole other ballgame when we're talking about kids. But what I don't ever worry about is when I have a meeting with like 3 or 4 people. I'm not thinking about compliance or accountability. It's a lot easier to engage in meaningful ways online synchronously with small groups. I also think that just for me personally, when I go through and reflect on, that role of me as the teacher, what's the most important thing that I do? I'm a former 2nd grade teacher. For me, small group instruction. I did whole group instruction, certainly, but my small group instruction is where I help develop readers and writers. And that's where I differentiated, and that's where I provided more individualized support. And that's where a lot of the artful teaching decisions were made. So for me, that's going to be a priority the whole group instruction I can handle by creating kind of foundational lessons, pulling data from that to guide some more flexible groups and meet students where they are. So I'd encourage you to be really flexible in thinking about what that live instruction needs to look like. And then the last strategy I would suggest is to think about how you can get every student responding. This is really powerful, especially with social distancing. And I'm going to drop in the chat real quick a YouTube video that a colleague of mine, Amanda Moore, she is Teach for the Win on Twitter, definitely worth a follow. She created this video, and in the description of the video, there's a link to some Google Slides templates for every student response activities you can do. So one example, I don't know if any of you have done this with your students, like the 4 corners activity, where you'd ask a question and every corner of the room is an answer, and they'd get up and physically move to that corner. We're obviously not doing that in the time of COVID, but she's created a Google Slides template where you can, every student has their name, or you could use their picture, and they would grab their name and drag it. Things that students can, well, we can't actively move around, and that's obviously ideal. All students can be responding, and thinking about that during synchronous instruction can be really great. It's also, if you are meeting online, doing those kind of things, whether it's with Jamboard or Google Slides or what have you, that allows you to get a really good idea of what students are actively engaged, who's with you and who's not with you. So I'm going to pause for a second. In the chat, I'd love for you to share, or you know what, you could turn your mic on. I'm not scared. If you'd rather just chat, what are some ways that you encourage that student to teacher interaction while physically or socially distant live?
So we do have middle school kids at our school that have definitely reached out to us via a Google form or an email to say that they were embarrassed or scared to show their faces, or they don't like the homes that they live in, or they've got too many siblings, screaming, screeching in the background. So actually, my partner and I on our team, we have had the kids wave to us. And so they know within the first 5 minutes, they're going to have to turn their camera on, but then the other 80 minutes that they're with us, they can keep the camera off. So it's really fun because what they've even started to do is like do shout outs to each other. And so when they've got their camera on, now they're not just waving, they're throwing up signs on there like, hey, so-and-so happy birthday, or love your haircut. And so it's really been kind of cool because they know that it's going to happen in the beginning, and it kind of gets them pumped and get them on time for class too, because we have a cutoff time. So that's one way that we've been able to get them participating.
That's really great. And I saw someone kind of share a thread on this on Twitter recently, where really it has so much more to do with the culture that you develop within the community of your classroom. If you focus on turning cameras on as a way to be compliant, then it's this, if that's the reason you're going to be in trouble if you don't turn it on, that's a whole different feel than keeping it optional, that having students know that turning on their camera means, you know, making faces at their friends or having fun and joking and building relationships. And we can, just like we work really hard to make our physical classrooms a safe space for our students, you have to work just as hard, probably harder online to do that as well. So I love that. That's a great idea. Anything else? Anyone else?
I use Zoom breakout rooms and really liked in those small groups, and they're all in breakout rooms, and I can join that and say, okay, where are you guys at? And then somebody will answer and 2 of them won't, and I'll say, okay, so and-so, where are you at? And I can call them out without it being like everyone in the class knows you don't know what you're doing. There's like 3 people, they all already knew you didn't know what you were doing because you weren't answering questions. And so it kind of relieves some of that stress by putting them in that small group and letting them do it that way.
Yeah, I love that. That's great. Awesome. Well, keep the ideas coming in the chat. We're going to move on to student interaction, or I'm never going to get this webinar done. Still thinking about synchronous instruction, getting students to engage with each other looks a little different this year. So keep in mind that we can still do discussions, we can have debates, rethinking what that live instruction time can be. especially if you are, talking about doing this in a Google Meet or in Zoom. Now they all have breakout rooms, so you can do some of those smaller conversations. Talking with social studies teachers at Ben Davis, like that is, we're in a hybrid environment at the high school. And I know a lot of them have really, like, those activities, the debates, the discussions around current issues, those are the things I didn't want to lose, and that was a priority for them. So they've structured their hybrid environment to prioritize that live. And so keep that in mind, that all of those things, it doesn't have to just be content delivery, initial content delivery. Also thinking about giving students a chance to showcase. I think that's easier than ever before with the digital tools, sharing our screen and teaching each other, using those breakouts for jigsaw activities, that kind of thing. Additionally, I really like this for face-to-face as well, for live instruction, thinking about using a back channel. This is something I did with second graders, so I think you can do it with even young learners. Now, full disclosure, I did it second semester with second graders. We had gained some skills in typing by the end of the year. But a back channel is essentially just a conversation that's happening concurrently during direct instruction. So if we were watching a video in class, I would always pull up it was Today's Meet when I was in the classroom, but there's YoTeach, which is essentially the teacher chat room app, equivalent to Today's Meet. You can use a Google document. Your students are already using Google Docs as a back channel, just not instructionally, so you can use it for good instead of evil. But you can use a discussion board in your LMS. Some LMSs have a chat room feature, but having students engage with each other in that way during live instruction can make it a more active experience. I also like the Q&A feature in Google Slides. So when you present, actually I can show you what it looks like. When you present in Google Slides, you can add the Q&A tool, and it adds this link at the top. And then everyone has access to this link. You can post questions and you can vote up other questions. This is another way to get students actively engaged with direct instruction, whether it is face-to-face or online. So yeah. And yes, Today's Meet is gone. So the YoTeach app is the replacement, the equivalent for it. Now, if you've missed Today's Meet, I'm gonna turn that off. Awesome. So during live instruction, even face-to-face with students socially distant, how are you getting students to interact with each other if they can't physically be next to each other? Again, use the chat or turn your mic on, either way.
So I'm teaching tech ed, and we're doing Project of the Way, and we're doing some coding. So when someone has a bug in their code, they're unable to get it to work. I have them share their screen, and then they kind of work through it, and then I can share with what they're doing wrong, or sometimes another classmate will often find their error first, and then they will kind of help them out.
That's great. Something similar, and this is actually a teacher in our district was doing this pre-COVID, and I think it really applies now as a way to help with tech support when you don't want to physically be really close with students. You don't want them, like before you might have had student helpers like that would go around and support their classmates, and we want to keep that physical distance now in the classroom. There's a teacher that just opened up a Google document. All the kids had access to it. There was a quick table. The student would write their name and the problem they're having. And the third column was a space for either the teacher to respond while they were leading a small group, or for other students to respond with support as well. And just that document would be projected on the screen so the teacher can keep an eye on it, just to make sure that there was nothing nefarious going on this document. But leveraging that to allow students to help each other even while socially distant, I think, is pretty powerful. Awesome. All right, so if we now think about student to content interaction during live instruction, how do we get students actively engaged with content? The first thing to remember is that we want to avoid long lectures, especially if you go online. Eye fatigue is real. Staring at a screen, we start to experience eye fatigue after about 20 minutes. So we're at the 30-minute mark. If you all haven't looked away at this point to look down at a piece of paper or something besides the screen, I'd highly encourage you to do that. The good news about that 20-minute rule is that it's not 20 minutes for the day. It's not even 20 minutes for the hour. Simply looking away and jotting something down on a piece of paper, for example, resets that internal timer for us. But what happens is if we stare at a screen for so long, and you probably can reflect on this yourself as a professional, that when our eyes start to get tired, our ability to process information also is diminished. So it's why I am a big fan of paper with online learning. Having students have paper, teach them some note-taking strategies, encourage them to jot things down. It can help with eye fatigue, certainly. But additionally, long periods of time, especially online where we are just delivering initial instruction, it's hard. The accountability piece is hard. Making sure that all students are engaged and present, that's enough to stress you out. And so I think it's the hardest thing to do online, and we don't have to do that online. So I would encourage you to do that. I'd also, I'm going to repeat this. So little foreshadowing, I'm going to repeat this for the asynchronous lessons, but building in lots and lots of opportunities to have students stop and reflect. Any sort of metacognitive activity, retrieval practice, getting students to stop and actively think about their thinking or what it is that they just learned. These reflection activities can be quick sketches. You can have students share a question that they're having or something they're confused on. These quick check questions, having them submit it to a Padlet maybe all at once, anything like that, getting students to stop and giving them a chance to process what they've heard, especially when we're working online, can be really powerful. It also helps with that accountability piece too. So even if you have whole group instruction happening, getting students knowing that they're going to have to stop and participate at some point is going to help ensure that your kiddos are paying attention. I am trying to catch up on the chat too. So that is a great question. I think one of the biggest struggles, and we're seeing it too, is if you ask me my personal opinion, I think in many situations we're relying too heavily on live synchronous instruction in fully remote environments. I don't think that's necessarily the best way to learn online. There's certainly examples of high quality synchronous online instruction, but if it were my classroom, I would not rely on a Google Meet all day. However, when what you know about what school looks like is what school looked like for you, or a more traditional sense, that communication, if you're not live with students, it can feel like to maybe a parent or to the community that teaching is not happening. And I don't know that I have a silver bullet answer for you, to be quite frank. I think a lot of it is just over communication and helping parents, having parent meetings, explaining the work that goes into designing instruction and how you're using the things that they're learning independently to meet the specific needs of their students. Just communicating those decisions. And again, it's not going to be perfect, but we have to do what's best for kids, certainly. And that's good. Yeah, I think the recordings, recording everything, that's one of the most powerful things about online learning, is that, we can have a record of everything that's happening, and that can be shared and revisited. I think the other problem with focusing too much on lots and lots of synchronous instruction is an equity issue. If a student can't get on, whether it's they didn't have the bandwidth to engage fully while live, or something came up in their schedule and they didn't make it, or they had a technology problem, then that's lost learning. And I don't know about you, but I don't want to, as an adult, watch an hour-long recording where I'm not actively engaged. And if I don't want to as an adult, I'm guessing our 13-year-olds don't want to as well. And so that's why I really think asynchronous instruction, when designed well, can be powerful. So I don't know if I answered your question at all, or if I'm just commiserating with you in that, but yeah, I just communicate. Another way that kind of tied to this last thing, this lots of opportunities for students to stop and reflect and engage during live instruction. Any sort of polling tool, these are some of my favorites. But I don't know if you all have different ones you like to use. Please share them in the chat. Mentimeter and Poll Everywhere are pretty standard polling tools. Answer Garden is similar, except students type their answer and it puts everything into a word cloud. And I really like Answer Garden. Slido, Susie, I'm not familiar with that one. If you want to in the chat give us some more details about what makes it special, I'll have to check it out. I think the last thing I'd say on synchronous instruction, specifically in terms of getting students engaged with the content, is that this is going to work best if what you're doing live and the material you're focusing on and the instructional decisions you're making live, if they are directly connected to the work that's happening asynchronously. Pre-COVID, there was some research done, I think it was actually done by Khan Academy, but looking at blended learning and when it's successful and when it's not. I am not someone that's going to tell you that just blended learning, I'm not going to blanket statement that this is the thing that's going to revolutionize your classroom. I think just like anything, we can do it well, we can do it poorly. And what this study found was that when there was a lack of connection between the live face-to-face instruction and then the online independent lessons. So imagine I'm teaching everything as I normally would face-to-face, and then during independent working time, students are moving through Khan Academy at their own pace, or maybe they're working through insert adaptive software here, right? Whatever that is, they're getting instruction that's just on their level. They're moving through it, adapts to their mastery and their proficiency, and that's all great. But if I don't use that to guide what's happening in my small group instruction or the reteaching that I do face-to-face, the research study found that there was really minimal impact. It didn't really change performance of students without that model. It didn't hurt anything, but it was learning a new tool, using technology without having a lot of benefit. But then what the study found was using like that adaptive software, using lessons that the teacher designed and taking some of that assessment data and using it to make decisions about what was happening in small group instruction when they were directly connected. That's where we saw the academic achievement really skyrocket. And so I think even within the constraints of a pandemic, that absolutely still applies. It's so important that they're working together and not just, I need to find something for my students to do when they're not with me. Any additional ideas about getting students to engage with the instruction, the material while live? Or any other tools that you like to use? Thanks again, Susie, for sharing that Slido. We'll have to check it out. If it's a lot like Mentimeter, what I like about Mentimeter is that you can create multiple questions during a presentation. So students enter their code to access my question and respond. And then when I hit, proceed, go to the next slide, I decide when the next question opens up and they're already in. So if you're going to do it multiple times throughout a session, it's a really nice tool. Oh, Quizlet Live is great for sure. Nearpod and Pear Deck is really great as a way to actively engage students. Has anybody had success with Nearpod or Pear Deck Live while remote? That's the one thing I'd be really curious about, is like, how are students doing okay with like split screen?
Yep, I do Nearpod just about once a week. They love it because they're on the same slide as me. So that's the thing that they have. Their two tabs open: Google Meet, Google Classroom, and then they have their Nearpod tab open. And you have to give them a little bit of extra time versus in class because they got to jump back and forth. But my students have responded very, very well to Nearpod because of the participation factor and finally being on the same page as everybody.
That's great. Kids always they always surprise us, right? They're so much more capable of things. I think something it would stress me out trying to figure that out, but give it to a 7-year-old and they can handle it. Rachel, yeah, you do become an actor, right? Even more so than in face-to-face classroom. I think you have to work so much more intentionally to humanize, to build those relationships.
And they also love Nearpod because you can push the same link to everybody when you're doing a video, and it doesn't lag as if like I was showing a video, and there's like hardly any audio cut out. So the kids know when they get a video, they love that because then they're not having to listen to anybody else's.
Oh, that's great. That's great. So definitely Nearpod and Pear Deck, to answer your question, Melanie, are both freemium tools. So there's a free version and then a paid version. And I believe for both of them, in the paid version, there's an asynchronous component where you can just give them, it's not something that has to be done live, and they can work through it, which I was really bummed. It makes me want to have a subscription for sure. Awesome. We'll keep the ideas coming in the chat. We're going to move on to asynchronous instruction, so designing those digital lessons. And this is my favorite part. I love designing asynchronous online lessons. And I think it gets kind of a bad rap sometimes, I think. But this is the most critical, interaction is the most critical component of a really high quality digital lesson. And so I think if that's the one thing you focus on, I would really encourage you. I actually, on my blog, perfectblendbook.com, and I can, at the end, I can go find the URL because I just thought about this. But my last blog post was I had created an asynchronous lesson template that really focuses in on interaction. And it's real simple. So it's like, do these 4 things and you have a digital lesson that you can feel proud of. So if you're interested in a structure for what that might look like, if you're feeling a little bit lost in designing those online lessons, I created that resource. You're welcome to use it and share it. But let's talk about on-demand learning, starting with student-to-teacher interaction. Like I said before, you're present. So I mean, you're facing the videos, using the messaging, responding to the discussion boards and the Flipgrid, and being present is one of the highest impact factors as far as your students' success. It's your social, emotional, and cognitive presence. Research tells us impacts engagement and motivation. So getting students to actually attend to the work and submit quality work. It impacts learning and achievement. And then finally, it also impacts academic integrity. And this is one of the most fascinating research studies that I've come across in terms of online learning, because it's the first thing folks talk about is, how do I know kids aren't cheating if I'm not physically in front of them? And we have this fear that when we move online, that cheating just becomes rampant. And this study that I reference in the book found that it has less to do with the environment and more to do with proximity. Now, this makes perfect sense face-to-face. So if I am teaching in a classroom and I give some sort of learning activity, students are more likely to cheat if I'm sitting at my desk checking my email than if I'm up moving around the room. It has nothing to do with the environment or the tools they have available to them. They have paper and pencil, they can pass notes. They are close enough, they can lean over and whisper answers. They can show their paper. It doesn't completely get rid of cheating, but me being closer to the learning impacts whether students are working honestly. And what they found is online, something very similar happens. It has a lot less to do with the environment and more to do with proximity. And while it's not a physical proximity, the closer the teacher feels to the learning that's going on, the less likely students are to cheat. And it has less to do with the fact that they can text their friends, that they can get on Google, that they can copy paste an answer, and has more to do with that teacher's presence. And I thought that was really powerful. Again, it's not gonna prevent cheating. I think if I could find the silver bullet way to prevent cheating completely, then I would have it made. But unfortunately, I don't have a surefire solution for that, just like I don't have a way to fix it in a face-to-face classroom either. But your presence is really, really powerful. Additionally, feedback, and this is something that's, I mean, this is true in any environment, but in your digital lessons, feedback is what is really, really critical. And when I started teaching online, that was one of the biggest eye-opening things for me, is how time-consuming feedback was online, even more so than it was face-to-face. I knew it was critical, but when everything was designed online, when everything is happening in that space, what normally would be kind of a spontaneous learning moment or a part of the instruction is now happening in addition to the instruction. And so what I've found is I've really had to be intentional about kind of scaling up my feedback. So just a couple of quick pointers for how you might make feedback a little bit more efficient. A colleague of mine, Sarah Wilking, she uses Google Keep, which is Google's post-it note tool, basically, to put comments that are regular comments she's giving for an assignment. So she teaches biology at our virtual school. And so she will use Google Keep to keep track of comments. So we're still giving personalized feedback, but a lot of times when you give an assignment, you're giving feedback to one student over something. They're likely not the only student to have had that misconception or to be doing that great thing. And so that has made her work more efficient. I like to think about really leveraging audio and video for a couple of reasons. One, it adds to teacher presence, humanizing that experience. It also is so much more efficient. I think that was when I got over my own fear of being on camera, that made my life as an online teacher so much easier, because I can say a lot more in 60 seconds than I can type. And if you have access to a learning management system, often those tools are embedded into the platform. So you can check an assignment, click that record button, and record feedback instead of typing it all out. So leveraging that was really powerful. I also would scale up responses. So if I had a discussion board going, instead of responding individually to every person's post, I would keep an eye on the post and I would just take some notes. Common themes, misconceptions I need to address as the whole class. I'd quote a few students to give them some public recognition, something that we often forget about online. We give all this feedback privately, and then we forget that public recognition is a motivator for a lot of our kiddos. And so thinking about ways to do that, being intentional about that is powerful, and getting kids to the table. But then what I would do is I would just jot some things down, record a quick 3-minute video, post it to announcements, address that feedback to the whole class whenever that was feasible, to also save myself some time. Rachel, I just discovered Mote as an extension for Google Docs too, and I loved it. So that is a Google Apps extension, Mote, M-O-T-E. Oh, I guess it's in the chat. And so it allows you to record audio comments on a Google document. Yep, Screencastify is great with the annotation tools. That's probably better than Loom. I use Loom, but I don't think I annotate quite as much, and I don't think it probably would be as good as Screencastify at that. Yep, that's awesome. What other ideas or tools to get students interacting with you independently or asynchronously? Actually, y'all are doing such a good job of just doing this in the chat. We can keep it moving. Let's go on to student interaction. Discussions are often the bread and butter for online teachers, so that's not new. Really leveraging any opportunity to get students engaged with each other. I just in a moment of being vulnerable with you here, I don't think I'm very good at leading discussions online, just to be completely honest. I've always struggled with them feeling really authentic in the way that they did face-to-face. I think it's hard to write good discussion questions that move beyond, here's your answer, reply to 2 peers, and they're just like checking boxes, right, where it becomes this compliance activity. If you experience that too, and maybe you are masters at the discussion board, and I think there's a place for it, certainly, and I still leverage it. But for me, what I found is I will regularly move text into a Google document so that we have annotation, or we'll do like a group close read and have conversations around text. We'll use the comment feature to engage with each other. I've done this with adults, I've done this with kids, and I've always found that the discussions feel a lot more genuine and organic using the commenting feature or using some of these other tools like Flipgrid or Padlet. You have a hard time getting them to respond live or in discussions. Because that's what I struggle with discussions, is I feel like making it worthwhile. So, so be flexible and ways to get students in dialogue. Yeah, and I think if you're talking about synchronous instruction, those discussions, I would leverage breakout rooms. A smaller group is less intimidating. Some of you might be experiencing this. If it were just like 4 of us talking about this, you might feel a lot more comfortable to turn your mic on or turn your camera on and talk. But then when we have 70 people in the room, turning your mic on, for some of us, it's really comfortable, and for others, it's a little bit intimidating. And so leveraging breakout rooms might help too. So I kind of mentioned this around having, close reads, group close reads around documents. I also like to leverage group notes or creating graphic organizers. And this doesn't have to be fancy. Like, I like to open a Google document. And if you're a Microsoft user, I apologize. Can you tell that we're a Google district? So if you just want to do your own internal find and replace every time I say Google with the appropriate Microsoft tool. But I'll get a Google document and create a table where every student gets a row, they write their name, and like one column might be they say, and the other column is I say. This is something they said in the video, and this is my reflection or my response to it. I mean, it doesn't have to be this really fancy activity, but any sort of using a table like that, or using slides where every student has their own slide, and giving them some sort of prompt or note-taking activity to do together allows, especially if you're asynchronous and they're maybe not working at the exact same time, it's a chance for them to engage with each other. I've mentioned Padlet and Flipgrid already. These are 2 of my favorite tools because I can use them in a lot of ways. Padlet I've been using forever because I love that, again, that second grade background. I'm constantly very much aware of terms of service for students that are under 13. And Padlet doesn't require a login. And I always felt really comfortable with their terms of service. And with Padlet, I can record audio, upload images and pictures and text, and I can use it across all content areas. So I love Padlet. Flipgrid's another one to get students talking to each other, and it's free to use. And I love it for multiple reasons, but I also love using it because I think our natural instinct when we're designing online is often to design these really silent experiences. If you think about the dialogue and how we engage with language face to face, we're talking all day long. And our kids are talking to each other, and we move online and everything becomes really text-based, and students are submitting work that is text-based. And so any chance we can get for students to engage in meaningful ways with language around content, it's absolutely necessary for our English learners. It's absolutely necessary for our youngest scholars, our emerging readers, but it's really just good for everybody. So that's why I love some of those tools. And catching up in the chat, and I love the wait time, like playing some instrumental music and giving students a moment to think through some of their answers. That helps because they're the students who can respond really quickly, and it might silence some of the rest of the class. It's probably a good practice just in person too. I love that. What other ideas or tools? Please feel free to continue using that chat. I'm going to actually move on to the next topic so that I can share some additional strategies, but please use the chat to share more ideas. But the last piece of interaction is student to content interaction. I think this is one of the most critical components of an asynchronous lesson. is getting students moving that content just from this passive consumption into an interactive experience. So one is to really think about interactive content, and there's a ton out there. I'm going to share a link with you here on the next slide with places to go to find some of this. But if you can leverage simulations or games, things that kids click on, that's great. That's a fast way to do it. Guru is an openly licensed educational resource website that has collections of interactive content. That's a great place to go for some learning objects. Additionally, if you head to this link, if you want to jot that down or take a screenshot, this Symbaloo, and if you're not familiar, Symbaloo is a visual bookmarking tool, is a collection of openly licensed educational resources. So what I mean by that is it's free to use, it's free to remix. You can use it in your class without having to worry about breaking copyright. And these are all specific to education, places you can go to find content for your students, for a classroom. It's a lot more efficient than trying to sift through Google or Pinterest or Teachers Pay Teachers. I want to give a shout out to my friend Kim Hendrick over at the CIESD. She created the original web mix, and I just remixed it from her and switched out some of the resources. So if you want to search for hers, you might like it better, but this is just some of my favorite resources. So I would encourage you to do that. Mary, thank you so much for dropping that in the chat. And Rachel, thank you for sharing all of those tools. I'm gonna have to like copy paste that and then go explore all of them. Something else that is really powerful when you're designing your content is to think about interactive video. Watching a video is a really passive experience, and using tools like Edpuzzle or PlayPause that allow you to either upload a video or find a video from YouTube or Vimeo and make them interactive. So you can pause and add questions that students have to answer before moving forward. You can pause the video and interject your own audio if you wanted to create some clarification or a prompt for students to be reflecting on while they watch. It adds an accountability piece, so you can force students to not be able to skip ahead. You can see how many times they've watched each segment of the video. It's really, really powerful. Both freemium tools. Edpuzzle is the one that I use primarily, and their free version has served me well. So I would encourage you to check those out. The other thing that's great about these two is that they have libraries. I'm all about working smarter, not harder. So they have libraries. If you're using a video you found from YouTube, especially if it's a popular one, there's likely other teachers that have used it. So you can actually take their Edpuzzles, their interactive videos, make a copy, and then make edits. Use the questions they have or change them out and work a lot more efficiently. Oh, cool. And I didn't know Nearpod had a new interactive video option. That's great. And VideoAnt. VideoAnt's another one, and I have minimal experience with that one, but it allows you to, students can take notes while viewing the video correctly, and then you can also add in some text alongside the video before you give it to students, I believe. Correct me if I'm wrong, though. But that's definitely worth checking out. And just like I mentioned before, the stop and reflect activities, any sort of quick checks, both synchronously and asynchronously. Asynchronous lesson, I think, should always have at least one of these. So some ideas. You could have students, take in a piece of content, whether they're reading something or they're watching something, and then have them write a one-sentence summary, something quick. I like those quick things because we have to create opportunities to be responsive to students learning and use that data to drive our live instruction. But if we only use these bigger assessments, then it might be 2 days before I get to grading it. And that doesn't really help me in driving like the live instruction that's happening. So anything that's quick like this, having them write a one-sentence summary, having them share what I call the muddiest point, asking what question you have, what was confusing, what did you struggle with on this assignment or not understanding this video, having students do sketches, having in the chat, what other ideas do you have for quick check, reflective or metacognitive questions you can ask students? I often will do like a 3-2-1, and maybe it's three key points, 2 new ideas, and 1 muddy point, or 2 questions that I have, 1 thing I want to learn more about. Oh, using the frame, I used to think, but now I think. Yeah, it doesn't take long for the students. It helps you know whether they've actually engaged with the content, gives them something to do with the content, and then it gives you actionable data to make instructional decisions. So I love that. I also like to think about active reading. So just in the same way that I want students doing something with video, like I mentioned before, I like to copy text and into a Google document and either send those out independently or do small group readings. Because if you think about that, built into a Google document or a Word document, you have free annotation tools. You can highlight. You can add text boxes with reflection questions, like stop and reflect questions for your students to answer. They can use the commenting feature to annotate. I can do things that I might not have access to fancy software that allows me to do that, but I have access to a collaborative document. And that's a way to help ensure that students are actively engaging with digital text. So keep your ideas coming. I'm gonna actually, let's see. I think that's it. I'm gonna skip through the next couple of slides because I talk too much. But I want to honor your time. So thank you so much for letting me chat with you. Thank you if you're joined into the book club or the book study, or you are going to be today. I am looking forward to continuing to engage with you all. That is my Twitter handle. I would love to stay connected and collaborate and chat about online and blended learning. So let me know if I can support you.
Thank you so much, Michelle. An hour goes really, really fast sometimes. So thank you very much. Thank you, everybody who joined us today. And I am going to paste into the chat again the steps to join the book study if you would like to join us in that organized, reading that we're into it, but feel free to join or check the book out yourself. A lot of great ideas, but thank you, Michelle, for this hour. Lots of great stuff. And I did record the webinar and we'll have that posted likely late next week or early the next because we've got to get the closed captioning in that. So I will send out an email to everybody who signed up when I have that posted so that you can rewatch or share it with coworkers. But everyone, just take care of yourselves and have a great evening. Thanks again, Michelle.